Russia launched this Oreshnik missile. Is it a real warning from Putin once again, or is it just a bluff?
It's all just scare tactics. It's just about getting podcasters like Joe Rogan to freak out about World War III. They get scared, and then they tell their politicians, stop supporting Ukraine. And I'm committed. I'm committed to seeing Russia defeated. I think this is in my personal best interest to live in a safer world in which these forever wars from Russia stop. The people of Russia hate us, and they're going to hate us for a very long time. So why would we let them win? Why would we allow the Russians to undo our victory in the Cold War? Russia is our enemy for the rest of my life. I'm confident of this.
Hi everyone, my name is Zhenya Melnik and this is UNITED24 Media. Today we're going to interview Jake Bro. He's a US Air Force veteran. He served as a missile and nuclear operations officer. Then after his service, he switched to YouTube blogging. He has a hugely successful channel. He focuses on the wider geopolitical issues with a high focus on Ukraine. Hi Jake, it's so nice to see you. First of all, thanks a lot for taking the time to speaking with us. The first question I would like to address. Yesterday, President Zelensky, he said that we need 10 to 12 additional Patriot systems that will ensure our lives and make the war meaningless for Putin, meaning that will make possible to close the sky over Ukraine. He said if our sky is fully protected, then Russians don't have any advantages in the sky. What do you think of such statement?
Ukraine is geographically the largest country in Europe. It's a lot of airspace to try and protect. I do believe that Western countries should be doing more to provide additional air defense systems. I don't really understand what countries like, for example, Portugal are concerned about as far as their air skies, being threatened. We need to reallocate resources because the priority is in Ukraine. If NATO is serious about defending Ukraine, helping Ukraine, stopping Russian aggression, then we need to stop making excuses. I know there's a dollar amount that goes through people's minds when they talk about transferring Patriot systems. This is like the most expensive mobile air defense system in the world, but this is the need. This is the priority. I don't know what takes a higher priority than what Russia is doing in Ukraine at the moment.
But do you think that will be really enough to close such a big country as you said, as Ukraine is?
10 to 12 additional. This would, I'm assuming, I don't have the maps, I don't have the specific details, but I'm assuming they're trying to get overlapping coverage of critical cities and critical infrastructure. But this is on top of the layering of all the other air defense systems provided, IRIS-T, Hawk, whatever. It's the menagerie of weapon systems that have been provided to Ukraine from all of the NATO partners. But Ukraine needs more. And eventually we have to get to a point where Russia doesn't see a benefit. They don't see a purpose. Launching million-dollar missiles to just be shot down over farm fields in Ukraine. Ukraine needs to protect their energy infrastructure to keep their economy going, and obviously the humanitarian aspect. It gets cold, it gets dark in the wintertime. And this is Russia's strategy, just to inflict maximum misery and pain through going after Ukraine's energy infrastructure. It didn't work in the winter of 2022. It didn't work in the winter of 2023. But, if something's not working, the Russian strategy appears to be just keep doing it until it does work. And it's not going to cause Ukraine to collapse or capitulate this winter, but it's all about costs. And providing the air defense systems now is a cheaper alternative than just to rebuild all of Ukraine's energy infrastructure once the war is over, which I'm assuming European partners are committed to. There's either the future cost, which will be much higher, or the cheaper cost today if you just provide the air defense systems.
Since we brought up Russia's strategy, what do you think is Russia's strategy in terms of Ukraine and beyond Ukraine? The long-term strategy.
Well, on my channel, I'm going to be blunt, and I don't think Russia has much of a strategy. This was supposed to be a 3-day special military operation. Initially, Russia launched a full-scale invasion with only 200,000 troops crossing the border. And I said this 3 years ago on my YouTube channel. How is a invasion force of 200,000 troops supposed to subdue a population of 40 million people actively resisting? This was nonsensical to me. if Ukraine actually wanted to resist. And we saw how catastrophic this full-scale invasion was for the Russians. Those first couple months, it was insanely chaotic. Russia then abandoned the Chernihiv and Sumy and the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and they tried to just focus on the Donbass region. But get out the ruler and measure. How far have they gone over 3 years of fighting in the Donbass region towards the city of Pokrovsk? And it's about 40 kilometers. Hundreds of thousands of killed, captured, and wounded. The official estimate from the United States was just released that Russia has spent over $200 billion just on this war over the last 3 years. But get out the ruler and measure. How far have they gotten? 40 kilometers. So I don't see the strategy being very good, but the Russians, let's just be honest, there's only one person making any decisions, and it's Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. And he's made the calculation that everything he's spent so far is somehow worth it if he can get a perceived victory for his people. I did watch your interview with Timothy Schneider, and I really appreciated what his definition of victory or loss was. As long as the Russian people think they've won, then that's a bad outcome for the world, because it'll embolden Russian aggression, and Putin someday will try this again in a different country, or they'll just attack Ukraine if there's a freeze in the conflict. So we do need, at some point, for the Russian people to say, this was a mistake, this wasn't worth it, and we should never do this again. There has to be some kind of deterrence. So you're asking specifically, what is the strategy? I don't know. I mean, losing 50 soldiers per 1 square kilometer taken, how is that worth it? How is 50 human lives worth basically a wheat field or a tree line? The armored vehicles they've lost, the lost economic potential due to sanctions the last 3 years. In every tangible, measurable way, this war so far for Russia has been a resounding defeat. But I don't think the Russian people believe that yet. I don't think the Kremlin elites believe that yet. They know things are not going according to plan, whatever that is. But they're not admitting that this was a mistake yet, and we need to get them to that point.
But maybe I put my questions in a little bit lousy way, but there are a lot of information that Putin plans to invade Europe by the end of this decade. What do you think of that? Do you think it's again just a bluff, or do they have the capabilities to do so?
If Ukraine had fallen within 3 days, as the Kremlin advisors were telling him, then yes, I think by this point in time, this is 3 years later almost, Putin would have gone into the Baltics. When you just look at Russia's history the last 110 years, they hate the Baltics. They hate that there are people there that identify as anything other than Russian, because they want that coastline along the Baltic Sea. I do think they potentially would have gone for the Suwalki Gap. When you look at and think about the territory of Kaliningrad, Kaliningrad doesn't touch mainland Russia. It doesn't touch Belarus either. If Ukraine had fallen and been absorbed into Russia, I think Belarus already would have been absorbed legally. Lukashenko would have retired. And I think, take Lithuania, connect Kaliningrad. How much farther? I do think maybe potentially Russia was never interested in attacking Finland. We can say that, but with Finland joining NATO, why didn't Russia get upset? Why didn't Russia complain about that or threaten to nuke the West? And it's because they've mentioned this on Kremlin State TV a couple times, that they really only want back the parts of their empire that they care about. Do they care about Tajikistan, or do they care about, perhaps Azerbaijan? Maybe not. Maybe they don't want to reabsorb those countries that were once part of the Soviet Union. But Ukraine and the Black Sea coastline, cities like Odessa, those have serious economic value. And of course, the Russians look at that and say, we want that. That should be ours. They were always going to go for that. They were always going to go for the Baltics. Putin wasn't a doubt in his mind.
Right. Thank you. Recently, after Russia launched this Oreshnik missile, they call it a mid-range ballistic rocket, but like Ukrainian defense intelligence says that it was intercontinental ballistic missile because it really can fly up to 5,500 kilometers.
800.
In 800. Okay, to your as for you. So, what do you know about this missile? And is it a real warning from Putin once again, or is it just a bluff?
Because the Russians and the Americans have satellites and they can detect these launches, you have to call the other person to let them know you're doing a test launch. Or in Russia's case, they were going to attack Ukraine. So 30 minutes prior to the launch of the Oreshnik missile, the Russians did call the Americans and say, hey, we're launching this. It's not a nuclear weapon. It's not heading towards you. It's heading towards the city of Dnipro. But it was always for propaganda purposes. It was always a psyop. This missile was being prepared to launch before permission was given for the use of ATACMS on the territory of Russia. And this doesn't change anything. Technically, this is an IRBM, an intermediate range ballistic missile. The classifications as far as like defense treaty purposes, 0 to 1,000 kilometers is short range. ATACMS are classified as short range ballistic missiles. Then there's 1,000 to 5,500, that's medium or intermediate range. And then above 5,500, that is ICBM long range. So technically, with the specifications of the Oreshnik that we know, it can go up to 5,800. Okay, yes, technically it can be an ICBM, but what targets in Europe would this be striking? And this was the Russians trying to say, hey, we can attack Berlin, we can attack Switzerland, we can attack Rome, whatever. That's the range, and Lukashenko is already saying that this new Oreshnik missile is going to be placed on the territory of Belarus and it's nuclear capable. It's all just scare tactics. It's just about getting podcasters like Joe Rogan to freak out about World War III, cry to his audience that, we're all going to die in a lake of fire unless we give the Russians what they want. When in reality, and this has been the reality for 3 years, there's nowhere that the Russians can use a nuclear weapon that will give them a net positive in their standing in the world or their ability to fight this war on the battlefield.
Also, they said that this launch was a response for the UK and US lifting their restrictions for the long-range usage of ATACMS or Storm Shadows. And so far, Ukraine has been quite successful in using these two systems, but also there is information that there is a limit to these rockets, like Storm Shadows, right? And in 2024, the UK's defense minister said that he plans to expand the production capabilities of such rockets, missiles. How long does it take to produce this weapon, and what could be an alternative if the production stalls for some reason?
I don't have specifics about production timelines for Storm Shadows or Scalps, but I do believe that this war has proven whatever our stockpiles are, they're not enough. I think NATO has built the defense of Europe around air power. And this is why Ukraine has always wanted F-16s or fighter jets, because most of the munitions that we build are designed for planes. The Europeans never expected this. If someone had thought long and hard about this, I think if Russia had attacked Europe, this would have been a land war, a protracted land war in which you'd need artillery systems and more tanks. And the Europeans just don't have these inventories. They don't have these stockpiles. And it's been 3 years. I'm not European, and I don't want to criticize my European partners, but they need to be doing more as far as defense production. They need to talk to their defense industries and say, what are you doing to expand capacity? The contracts will be there. Don't worry about the upfront investments. We will be purchasing artillery rounds for the next 30 years nonstop just to replace what we've lost supporting Ukraine. So as far as Storm Shadows and Scalps and the production timelines, I don't have any of those specifics off my top head. I'm sure we can look that information up, but I do think the Europeans need to get serious about allocating their resources to ensure that if something like this happens again anywhere in the world, if they want to be of use, if they want to be helpful, they need larger stockpiles, larger inventories, and some kind of political process to make all these deliveries and approvals faster. That's the most frustrating part, is just the delay, the delay, the delay. People are dying. Why can't we make these decisions a little bit faster?
My personal belief, if we got certain systems a little bit sooner, then maybe we would have a different situation on the battlefield. Actually, what do you think? Maybe what do you know? Since, okay, now they're permitted to have this long-range strikes, but didn't Russia already also prepared for it and moved their headquarters and, like, I don't know, warehouses further than we can reach? Is it a little bit too late for that?
As far as what can be hit within 300 kilometers, there's still ammunition depots, there's still fuel warehouses. As far as logistics, the Russians just can't move everything back 300 kilometers. They've moved most of the stuff already back 300 kilometers to protect it. And we've seen the tangible benefits as far as a reduction in glide bomb attacks on the front. If Russian planes have to fly greater distances, then they can only do so many combat missions in a day. So the approval given has already equated to a reduction in these attacks. The approval should have been given, honestly, since day one. Whatever weapons we gave to Ukraine, they should have been allowed to defend themselves and fight back. Shoot the archer, not the arrows. These planes, these airfields, they should have been eliminated years ago, to be honest. But the threats of nuclear war and the calculations made by the West, I think there was always this magical thinking that Russia would realize their mistake, especially in 2022. Macron and Scholz were always talking about off-ramps. How can we give Putin an off-ramp so that he can admit this was a mistake, and then we can go to negotiations and de-escalate? It's always been about, let's give the Russians the opportunity to de-escalate. But at some point in 2023, everyone realized this was never going to happen. Putin has committed himself to this path of genocide and mass murder, and he's an internationally wanted war criminal by the ICC. Putin is never attending another Olympics in a democratic country. He's not rejoining the G7. Like, he's not going to a UN General Assembly in New York City ever again. He's accepted this. And I think he knows that in 10 or 20 years, whoever succeeds him as the leader of Russia will probably also be an internationally wanted war criminal and will not be part of these international organizations and institutions. So the world is divided more than it's been since 1991 with the Cold War. We could call this Cold War II already. It's not World War III. If only Ukraine is fighting, how can you call that World War III? But it does have the serious potential to become a hot war with more countries involved. It wouldn't be a long war, but it would be a devastating war if there was a nuclear exchange. I take that threat very serious. I make the argument we don't need to worry about it at this moment. Russia must be deterred to prevent future wars, to prevent endless wars. If we abandon Ukraine, we will only embolden autocracies around the world, and they'll become more belligerent towards their neighbors. We'll have more conflicts, and this is not good for global peace and security.
Right. Thanks. Ukraine used to be this third biggest country in terms of nuclear weapons. Then we signed, or I don't know, forced to sign this Budapest Memorandum, and Russia was one of the signees. And now Russia occupies 20% of Ukrainian land, if not more. So there is a big discussion about whether Ukraine should do something about gaining its nuclear status back. So do you think it's feasible at all?
If Ukraine is able to join NATO, then they don't need their own nuclear weapons. Zelensky has said, this is the choice. We're going to let the West decide. Either allow us to join NATO, and then we have your nuclear deterrence, your nuclear umbrella. But if you reject us, if you isolate us, if you leave us alone on our own with Russia as our neighbor, then we have to get our nuclear weapons back. Russia only respects strength, and dictators around the world are watching if Putin can get away with this. If threatening to nuke people allows you to talk about historical claims and redrawing the maps of the world, then every authoritarian, every dictator in the world is going to want nuclear weapons because that's the ultimate trump card. And then we have proliferation on the other side. Smaller democratic neighbors to autocracies are going to say, I need nukes. I can't trust the Western powers. I can't trust France. I can't trust Great Britain or the United States to help me when a nuclear power attacks me. So Poland, Finland, Australia, South Korea, Japan, whoever, they're all going to say, we immediately need to start developing nuclear weapons because at some point in the future, we're not going to receive supports. We're not going to receive help. So during the Cold War, the United States had the correct strategy: prevent nuclear proliferation. The fewer countries that have these weapons, the safer the world is. So we partnered with as many countries around the world as possible, saying, we have the nukes. You don't need to maintain and develop and store these things. We'll be your umbrella and shield. And I think, I think America's position in the world is diminishing. It's retreating. And there is this movement politically in the United States for isolationism. We don't care about the problems in the Middle East or East Asia or Europe or the Caucasus, but that's a mistake. America has gone through periods of isolationism in the past, and in ignoring problems never makes those problems go away. The problems just grow and get worse over time.
The Times media reported that Ukraine could build a simple nuclear bomb within 3 months. Do you think it's just trying to get some hype, or is it actually technically possible?
It's entirely technically possible, yes. So there's two things here. There's, can you build a nuclear weapon, and can you build the delivery system, an ICBM or a cruise missile? Ukraine's not building an ICBM anytime soon that can hold a nuclear weapon. But as far as, so there's two materials you can use to make a nuclear weapon. You can either use enriched uranium, which is a more expensive process, or you can use the waste product from civilian nuclear power plants. You can use plutonium. Ukraine has the plutonium from their civilian nuclear reactors. This is part of the reason why democratic countries don't want autocracies having civilian nuclear programs, because you can use the waste to build bombs. So yes, I'm 100% confident Ukraine has the scientists and the technical know-how to do this. It's not going to be, it's not going to be an H-bomb. Like, it's not going to be a high yield nuclear device. It'd be a lower yield, but they have the capacity, of course. And this is not a good thing for the world. We should not be encouraging this. We should not be promoting this idea. The alternative, and it's the better alternative, just find a way for Ukraine to join NATO, and then we can end these wars.
Yeah, I mean, Ukrainian officials had to explain many times that we officially are not doing that, but still, once it's outside in the media, everyone's talking about it, so I had to ask you about this. Next question, Assad's regime has fallen already in Syria. How will this impact Russia's geopolitical ambitions?
The views I've been getting on my YouTube channel have surged in the last 2 weeks. And partly it's just people who are interested in the Syrian conflict. But I think this is people who support Ukraine and they oppose Russia. And this is one of the clearest indicators we've had. This is irrefutable, tangible proof of Russian weakness. Russia spent a fortune building these bases in Syria. They've lost thousands of their own soldiers over the last decade fighting the rebel groups and the terrorists and propping up the Assad regime. This airbase and this naval base on the Mediterranean was Russia's outpost to project strength in the Middle East, project strength in the Mediterranean and across Africa. So this node has now been cut. It's been severed. These bases will be fully evacuated. I think at the moment the rebels are not storming or attacking the bases because Turkey is the one who's been basically funding and aiding the rebels. Turkey has told the rebels, let the Russians peacefully withdraw. As soon as they pull out, though, those bases belong to you now. And how can Russia let this happen? If Russia is in a position of strength, if Russia is actually winning, why would they give up on these bases? Why would they give up on Assad? Why would they give up on Syria? And it's obvious they just don't have the resources. They don't have the soldiers. They don't have the capacity. All of their best pilots are bombing cities and hospitals and cafes in Ukraine. They can't respond to what the rebels did. Aleppo fell in 3 days. It was insane. This is a city of 2 million people. And the Russians couldn't do anything. Now, Assad wasn't helping. He was not very popular. He was a terrible ruler and very oppressive. But there's no way for anyone who supports Russia to spin this as strength or spin this as some kind of victory. And yeah, I think if Russia lacks the capacity to prop up Assad and save Assad, then maybe Iran is weaker than we thought. Maybe Lukashenko in Belarus is weaker than we thought. I saw a report this week that with gas supplies to Transnistria being cut off, Transnistria in Moldova is facing catastrophe, and maybe the Russian troops are going to have to withdraw out of there. There's, these tentacles are spread out across the globe, and you can just start connecting the dots. Can Russia hold on to the parliament in Georgia? Does their money and influence still have the same impact? Now that everybody who has been sympathetic or purchased by the Russians saw what happened in Syria. This is a calamity for the Russians, and they're just trying not to think about it, not to talk about it, and hope the world doesn't pay attention. But the world is paying attention right now to Syria.
You mentioned your viewers. I know you have a huge community. Which questions about Ukraine are the most weird or challenging for you?
I think a lot of people just don't know that much about Ukraine. I didn't know that much about Ukraine prior to 3 years ago. And there is this belief of, well, aren't they basically Russian? Isn't Ukraine just a region or a province of Russia? And for me, learning about the history of Ukraine and this geography in the world, this midway point between Central Europe, the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, and then the Russian Empire, the Polish Commonwealth, and the culture and the language. You guys are completely different than the Russians. And this nonsense about, the mythical Kievan Rus going back 1,000 years and you're all one people, it's nonsense. It's propaganda. If anything, Russia is a continuation, I think, of the Mongol Empire, the brutality of the Asian steppes and those people. And it's completely different than, the Black Sea coast and the legacy of the Byzantine Empire. It's all noise. It's all propaganda. You're asking specifically what's a frequent or a common question. And I think people try to imagine, what if I was living in Ukraine? For someone who, lives in California, let's say, they try to imagine, what would I do? How would I respond if I was in a country that was brutally invaded by Russia? And I think the world has been impressed with the strength and resilience of Ukrainians. But at the same time, what choice do you have? Not everyone can be or wants to be a refugee trying to get protected status in Germany or France. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Ukrainians have done that. But for everyone choosing to stay, and they've got the power cuts, they've got the air raid sirens, they're always having to go downstairs, their kids have to go to school remotely online because it's not safe to be in a physical building. The Russians target schools. It just sounds like an exhausting nightmare. And the people of Ukraine have my support, they have my sympathy, and I think for the rest of the world, they're just trying to understand what's it really like, and how are they doing this? How have they been holding out for 3 years against a country 3 to 4 times their size, with these vast Soviet weapon stockpiles? I think we need this war to end, and then we need some time and distance to absorb all this information of what's been happening. Because every day it's just one big news story after the next. And I think for the average person just trying to live their daily lives, they're trying to be informed, they're trying to care, but I don't think people can comprehend what exactly has happened and how significant it's been the last 3 years.
It's a little bit of a maybe not so professional questions, and we might have to cut it out. But as a journalist, as a media, we feel that there is like a decline in the interest, especially if we are talking about. I mean, like the explosions have happen every day. And I heard a quote by a fellow journalist. She's from Ukraine. She's great, Melania Podolyak. She said, instead of focusing on Ukraine and trying to explain to a regular American what Ukraine is, that we are not just war, but there is, I don't know, beautiful nature, great culture, blah, blah, blah. She says that we need to focus more on the explaining why Russia is evil. Would you agree with that? Or shall there be some balance?
What human emotion do people respond to stronger? Sympathy or fear? You know, if we can tell human interest stories about the suffering of the Ukrainian people, yes, that will evoke sympathy in people around the world. Those stories are important, but they don't really move people to react. It might motivate you to give a donation to a charitable organization to help if you're financially able to. But if you can invoke fear, and I do believe the Russians are a serious threat, they're a serious threat to everyone, that will then lead people to change their mindset and lead them to political activism to get their governments to respond to that threat. I'm going to give you my argument to my fellow Americans why we should continue supporting Ukraine. And my argument, yeah, I can make the arguments for sympathy. The Ukrainians are deserving. The Ukrainians are the most pro-American country in the world right now. Why would we betray them by cutting off military aid? But the threat is American weapons in the hands of Ukrainian soldiers have killed and wounded hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers. It's the Ukrainians on the battlefield. There are no secret NATO troops in the trenches or whatever. It's not NATO forces or Americans putting in the launch codes to ATACMS missiles. It's Ukrainians. But to the Russians, there's no difference. To the 700,000 Russian families of Russian men who have been killed or wounded, they know where those missiles came from. They know where those artillery shells came from. They know where those tanks and javelins came from. And Russia's never going to forgive us. There is this aspect in American society of let's just disengage. We elected Trump. We can just reset, and then we can have good relations with Russia again. And that's just never going to happen. Russia is our enemy for the rest of my life. I'm confident of this. As long as Putin remains in power and the Russian people don't admit this war was a terrible mistake, then no American is going to be safe for the rest of my lifetime, because American weapons in the hands of Ukraine, it doesn't matter how we got to this point. You can hate Joe Biden, you can hate the Democrats and Jake Sullivan. People in Russia don't care who's a Republican or who's a Democrat. It has been Americans with American taxpayer dollars providing these weapons to Ukrainian soldiers that have killed and wounded hundreds of thousands of Russian troops. The people of Russia hate us, and they're going to hate us for a very long time. So why would we let them win? Why would we allow the Russians to undo our victory in the Cold War? When for a tiny fraction of our defense spending, our overall federal budget, and our GDP can help Ukraine win this war, cause the Putin regime to collapse, and then we can get real reform in Russia. That's the reset we need to get out of this situation, not just allowing Russia to win and then hope that they forgive us for the last 3 years.
What do you think could NATO learn from this war that we are experiencing right now? Because I know NATO is adapting. I know they're already learning, but really this is the biggest conventional war that is happening in the last decades, what would be your lessons if you were in NATO yourself?
I've been thinking about the question, why did NATO not dissolve after the Soviet Union collapsed? Why did NATO continue to exist? And a very strong argument for why NATO continued to exist is if you're in the NATO alliance, and let's say you're Germany or you're Denmark or whatever, all of your neighbors are also in the NATO alliance. So there was no incentive to build up your military because you're not going to war anytime soon. The NATO alliance has kept the peace on the European continent up until Ukraine because everyone was in the alliance. And I think these countries, especially in Europe, who let their militaries atrophy and decay for lack of use, for lack of experience, that's a problem. And I think a lot of people in Europe just imagine this would never happen. We've got these pipelines coming from Russia. We give them all this money for their oil and gas. Why would Russia ever go to war with their best paying customers? And I guess the Russians were dumb enough to do that. There's now strategic planning and strategic thinking about where does the European continent get their energy resources for one, but now they also have to be thinking about their manufactured goods. How dependent does the European continent want to be on China? When China, every clear indication is they're building up to attack and invade Taiwan. And Taiwan is not some insignificant tiny island in the Pacific. It's 20 million people. The population of Taiwan is greater than Portugal, greater than Romania, greater than Sweden. It's a tiny island, but they have a lot of people and they're an economic superpower. So when this day comes, if this day comes, and I hope deterrence succeeds, but the Europeans and NATO have to ask, where do we get our stuff? Who are we dependent on? And I think in the 90s, there was this golden opportunity, the end of history, like economics and capitalism will integrate everyone, and then we just won't have these large-scale wars anymore. And what we're learning from the Russians and Vladimir Putin is no. If you're an autocracy, if you're a dictator, what we're learning is it's never enough. Elon Musk said this, that Putin is the richest man in the world, having stealing the wealth of the Russian people for 24 years. The oligarchs are all getting rich. Why do you need more? Why do you need to invade Ukraine and steal their stuff? And it's just compulsion, like it's just human nature. When you have supreme unchecked power in your own country, every dictator has the exact same idea. Well, I can get more if I just attack my neighbor, kill them, and steal their stuff. This is what the Chinese are thinking. This is what the Iranians are thinking. This is basically empire. This is what human civilization has been doing for 10,000 years. Expand, expand, expand. Use your militaries. Kill your neighbors before they can threaten you. The United States, since the Bretton Woods Agreement, has been trying to do something different. Can we end the age of empires? Can we create an economic order where everyone gets rich as long as you compete economically? You don't need to go to war to get wealthier. So the NATO alliance has to rethink all of their partnerships with autocracies because we can't be dependent on them for anything, because they will exploit those dependencies to get concessions, to attack their neighbors and say, don't get involved, otherwise we'll shut off our uranium exports, we'll shut off our chip exports, we'll shut off whatever. These are all pressure points, and I think we need to reevaluate everything and say the democratic alliance around the world cannot be reliant on autocracies for any economic necessary resource.
It's been actually, I think, exactly 1 month since North Korean troops has been sent to Ukraine. How do you evaluate all this process?
Just for propaganda, functionally, they serve no benefits. 10,000 troops is about a week and a half of casualties for the Russians. So if Russia is having a mobilization problem, if they're having a conscription problem or whatever, if they don't have enough troops for this war, I'm sorry, but 10,000 guys from North Korea makes absolutely no difference. And this was not a great time for Kim Jong-un to send his troops to Russia. I mean, Moscow in December is not very pleasant. So we've been getting reports. I don't think we have visually confirmed the use of North Korean troops being used in meat wave tactics or being used on the front lines. I know there's been casualties, especially that Storm Shadow strike on a command post. And I think Putin wanted North Korean troops for the propaganda win. It's all about making podcasters like Joe Rogan freak out about World War III. We need to abandon support for Ukraine. Look, North Korea is getting involved. We now have two nuclear superpowers attacking and bombing European cities. So functionally, it makes no difference. But politically and psychologically, I do think it has had an impact. On my channel, I make fun of the North Koreans. I think North Korea is objectively one of the stupidest countries in the world. Their cult of worship of the Kim family and all the absurdities of it. Culturally, I think there's going to be a lot of conflicts between the North Koreans and the Russians. And the Russians on Telegram channels who have interacted with the North Koreans, they've already highlighted these, that they've tried using North Koreans, but the North Koreans can't tell the difference between Ukrainians and Russians. Just a bunch of white people looking the same, so they kind of just shoot at everyone. So that's not great. Sending guys into battle, and if you don't look North Korean, they just shoot at you. And then there's the aspect of these North Koreans never leaving the hermit kingdom. Like, they've never seen internet before. They've never seen Netflix or tasted Coca-Cola. Like, these North Koreans are seeing and experiencing things they've never been allowed to see and experience before. I argue these North Koreans have been tainted. They've been contaminated. And Kim Jong-un has already made up his mind they're never going to be allowed to return. Kim Jong-un doesn't care. He's got millions of men in his army, but he's being paid. This is all about money. North Korea is one of the poorest countries in the world, and the North Koreans at the moment are taking advantage of the Russians. They're exploiting them. They're getting a satellite launched into space. They're getting rocket technology. They're getting a nuclear submarine. They're getting jets, and then cash. Cold, hard cash in addition to cheap oil and gas. Like, the Russians are willing to give the North Koreans anything for this propaganda and political win of North Korea signed a defense treaty with us, and they're fighting on the front lines with us when the tangible impact on the battlefield is near negligible.
Recently, North Koreans, they gave Russia M1991 MLRS system. How is it different from Grad BM21, or is it any different? Do you know anything about this weapon system?
Well, I'm sure specifications, payload, range, there are variations and differences, but once again, big picture, tangible benefits on the battlefield, it doesn't make a difference. An artillery piece is an artillery piece. If the North Koreans can and are willing to provide anything, the Russians are desperate. They will buy it, they will take it. And I do want to highlight that the military assistance coming from countries like Iran and North Korea, it's not free. The Russians have to pay for everything. Whereas NATO partners providing aid to Ukraine, that's a donation. That's free. We're doing that just to protect the security of Europe and the international rules-based order. So this is how I've thought of the war the last 3 years. The real war map is not deepstatemap.live. It's not, the Donbass region. The real war map is Russia's bank accounts. This war will end when the Russians can't pay for this stuff anymore. And I don't know how close we are. Nobody knows how close we are to that point in time. But if we can get the price of oil to go down, if we can increase sanctions, if Russia's central bank continues raising that central rates, nobody a month ago predicted that Assad would fall, that Syria would be liberated from the Russians. Nobody a month ago saw that coming. So when autocracies and dictatorships collapse, it's rapid. It's always like this. Everybody in the system is miserable. They don't want to defend it. As soon as there's the slightest disruption or pushback, I mean, we saw the videos in Syria. Everyone just takes off their uniform, pretends like they were never a part of this oppressive system, and they just dissolve. The same thing at some point, we're not there yet. The same thing at some point is going to happen in Russia. The people of Russia are just going to say, hey, this is intolerable. I just can't take this anymore. I'm not going to fight to defend the Putin regime anymore. We're not there, but for the people of Russia, things can always get worse.
Jake, thanks so much. It was really great talk. Really, I enjoyed greatly. Yeah, I hope maybe sometime next when something else crazy or not so crazy, maybe something good will happen. We don't know. But if we could do it some other time, that would be amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, sounds wonderful.
Thanks so much for watching this with us. I hope it was as interesting for you as it was for me. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave your comment, and see you next time.